any political body that we elect and then gather, that we elect them for their joint wisdom, but they also bring with them this diversity of interest and ideology and political point of view. And Franklin said, from such a group, could a perfect production ever be expected?
Well, good evening. Welcome. Thank you all so much for coming out this lovely evening. Looks like we just missed the rain a little bit. This should be a very wonderful conversation about democracy tonight. Before I forget, I want to ask you to all turn off your cell phones and pagers. My name is Jana Barbier, and I am the Cultural Arts Coordinator for the Newport Beach Public Library. We want to thank the Newport Beach Public Library, namely Cynthia Cowell. Cynthia is our director, and she had requested that we pursue this California Reads grant from the California Council for the Humanities. We also want to thank the Newport Beach Public Library Foundation. Tracy Keys, they matched our grant, which was wonderful, and the tremendous support. And also from the Newport Beach Film Festival and the staff at the Newport Beach Library. Did you all get a card when you came in? Because there's a great card. Let me show it to you. This one, if you didn't get a chance, grab one, because this illustrates all the great programs that we have in relation to this program. Most of all, we want to thank the California Council for the Humanities for their wonderful insight into searching for democracy during this election year, and for making this program possible with excellent programming related to democracy across the state of California. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce John Carroll from the California Council for the Humanities. Come on up, John.
Well, good evening, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. How many of you heard of what formerly was known as the California Council for the Humanities, but as you now see with our lovely new little banner here, we're now actually called Cal Humanities. We just changed this a month ago. So how many of you are familiar with Cal Humanities? Anyone? Well, good. We have a whole audience full of new people, so we want to welcome you. So thanks very much for coming this evening. I'm John Carroll. I'm the Director of External Affairs for Cal Humanities. And we want to welcome you, as I said, to our Author and Conversation event this evening with Dr. Richard Beeman. Cal Humanities, just in case, a little bit of education here, is a nonprofit organization. It's a private nonprofit and a leader in statewide humanities programming, as well as grant funding within the state of California. We produce, fund, and support cultural experiences in media, literature, discussion programs, and events like this one this evening. By supporting engaging and inspiring work, we want our audiences we want to encourage our audiences to learn more, to dig deeper, and to start conversations that matter, to create a state of open mind. So that's our new tagline. It's something that we try to live by in everything that we program. Tonight's event is part of a larger event called California Reads, a statewide reading program around 5 books on the nature of democracy. And from now until November, there will be 600 events like this taking place all throughout the state. So we encourage you to check out our website, calhum.org, to learn more about things that are happening here within your community as well as other neighboring communities and throughout the state. We couldn't do this without our wonderful partner, the California Center for the Book, and of course our library partners here at the Newport Beach Library. So this evening, I would like to once again thank you for being a part of it, encourage you to visit our website and learn a little bit more about us. And now I'd like to turn it over to Mary Menzel, the Director of California Center for the Book and tonight's moderator. Thanks very much.
Thanks, John. I'm so pleased to see this full room. Thank you for coming out tonight. And I'm extremely pleased to have a really distinguished guest with us. Richard Beeman recently retired after 43 years at the University of Pennsylvania as a professor, department chair, and dean. He has published many books and has lately moved from academic writing to writing for what he calls that elusive, intelligent general public.
That's you folks. We hope.
Recent titles include The Penguin Guide, of course, which we featured in California Reads, and Plain Honest Men, The Making of the American Constitution, which won the 2010 George Washington Book Prize, an award which honors the most important new book about America's founding era. Plain Honest Men was sort of a precursor to The Penguin Guide, was it?
Yes.
The research.
The research in Plain Honest Men took place over 40 years of my professional career. It was the Constitution is a subject which I've always had a great passion for, and it was the book that I knew I would eventually want to write. And so it just sort of came out at a certain mature phase in my career.
Yeah. Well, I feel as though I need to get this question out there right now. We hear about originalism. We have different ways of looking at the dead Constitution, the living Constitution. I don't know if there's any way to briefly tell us, but is there any way that we can know what the founders wanted, meant? Is there any point at all? Is it crazy to try to think about what the founders meant?
So Mary has asked a very important and hot button question in our current judicial and political climate. The Supreme Court justices themselves are divided on the issue. Obviously, Congress, which is divided on everything, is divided on this. So it's an important question, and it is a question which is more or less guaranteed to alienate some portion of the audience from me at the very outset of our discussion, because it is one on which Americans have differing views, and I do have my own views on this subject. I really want to break it down into three questions. The first question is, just philosophically, should we allow the intent or the thoughts of these men who lived 225 years ago, overwhelmingly wealthy white men, about half of whom were slave owners, should we be bound by their thoughts? And I think that's a question to ponder. But I won't answer that question. I, more than most people, have enormous respect for those men. Significantly greater respect for them than I do, for example, for our current members of Congress. But we'll go there later. So let's say yes, and for the moment. Then the question is, so how do we determine what their intent was? Honestly, having lived with these 55 men who sat in the Philadelphia Convention through the summer of 1787 and listened in to their debates and often divisive disagreements on such fundamental issues as the meaning of federalism, the nature of executive power. Article 2 of the Constitution says the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States, period. You know, what in the world does that mean? And there were probably as many opinions about what that meant in the convention as there were delegates. What is the meaning, and this is highly relevant, it's going to be highly relevant in the healthcare decision coming up. What's the meaning of Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 18, the so-called necessary and proper clause, that Congress shall have all power necessary and proper for carrying into effect the aforementioned powers? Again, there were as many opinions among the framers as there were framers. So I just don't think it's possible to speak with certainty about what either that original meaning or what that original intent was. Now, I will say that I've had on 2 occasions an opportunity to make the point that I just made with Justice Scalia, who is the foremost and most articulate and certainly the most vigorous and passionate proponent of the doctrine of originalism, of interpreting the Constitution according to the original meaning of the words as they were written on those 4 parchment pages. And I basically say what I just said to you. And he said, well, Professor Beeman, that's all well and good, and I know this is not a perfect form of interpretation. But what's your alternative? To make it up, right? Just make it up as you go along. In fact, that's not my alternative, but my exchanges with Justice Scalia have been brief, and I've never gotten to rebut his rebuttal. But part of my rebuttal is really my third question, which is really in answer to the question you asked me. What would the framers have thought? Would they have believed that we should be bound by their conception of the meaning of those words on those 4 parchment pages? And there were some differences among them. Jefferson and Madison, toward the ends of their life, had this fascinating discussion about the immutable Constitution versus the ever-changing Constitution. Jefferson was a proponent of the ever-changing Constitution, and Madison, in his old age, was quite proud of his own accomplishments as a framer of the Constitution, and tended to maybe fall more on the Scalia side, but most of them had too much humility to believe that their attempt to create a more perfect union, not a perfect union, should be binding on subsequent generations. They understood that what they were embarking on was an experiment, a fragile experiment that would be subject to change. I could go on, but because just as I say that, I know exactly what Justice Scalia would say to me in rebuttal, but I'm not going to make his argument for him.
Well, I know in the book The Nine by Jeffrey Toobin about the Supreme Court, he quotes Justice Scalia as saying that one of those living Constitution people, goes home to his wife every day and says, the Constitution means just what I say it means. And he seemed very dismissive of that idea, certainly.
Well, sometimes when I want to really irritate people, I do say, I am a believer. That phrase "living Constitution" is really a red flag now, so it's not the phrase that I like to use. But I do believe over time the Constitution has meant what the American people believe it to mean. And by that, I don't mean what came out today on some issue in the latest CNN, ABC News poll, not the momentary opinion of the American people, but the settled opinion of the American people. So the settled opinion of the American people was that the 1857 Dred Scott decision was a really bad decision. The settled opinion of the American people came to mean in 1954 when the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that segregation was a violation of the Constitution, directly overturning a previous case. But the fact is, although a few Southern governors didn't like that decision, the settled opinion of the American people was and has proven to be that was the right decision. So by that, when I say that the Constitution means what the people says it means, we have to wait a while to figure out what the American people really think it means.
Can I back us up in time for a little bit? Because it seems to me that in school, say, it's really fun to learn about wars and talk about wars, and there's all the iconography of the Revolutionary War. And when you said fragile experiment, it reminded me that really how much do we know about this politicking and horse trading and the painful process by figuring out our Constitution, whereas I think when you're young, you think we won a war. And then we got the USA. And reading your work makes me realize over and over how it could have all just gone disastrously wrong very soon after the Revolutionary War.
Let me just give you one small anecdote about the contingency. Actually, one of my articles of faith as an historian is that nothing is inevitable. And the contingency of decisions that if they'd gone one way or another. The Constitutional Convention was supposed to have begun on May 14th, 1787. On May 14th, James Madison and George Washington, two rather distinguished delegates from Virginia, marched to the Pennsylvania State House, now Independence Hall, to attend the opening of the convention, and found that aside from the delegates from Pennsylvania, all of whom lived in Philadelphia, they were the only delegates who showed up on time. The only delegates who showed up on time. Washington truly didn't want to be there at all. He wanted to be back at Mount Vernon. And he was certainly not he was not certain that this convention would be a success. Washington was infuriated by this. Now, looking back, wouldn't any of us, if we'd been elected delegates to the Constitutional Convention, we would have showed up on time? But in fact, it took 11 more days till May 25th for a bare majority of state delegations, 7 of 13, to show up. The moral of that story is that the success of this convention was not only not preordained or divinely inspired, it was in many senses improbable. These folks were trying to create that more perfect union against great odds, the apathy and provincialism of the American people. And it was hard work that summer, every bit as hard as the work that any session of Congress engages in. A lot of political scientists like to describe the Founding Fathers as political thinkers, because they did probably have a greater grasp of sort of classical political thought and theory than maybe most politicians do today, or certainly most of us do today. But they weren't political thinkers. They were thinking politicians, and first and foremost politicians. And as politicians, they really did know that the process of legislating and of state building was hard work. And you had to go after it day after day to begin to get it right.
Well, when you mention provincialism, that calls to mind your discussion of the Electoral College. And you state pretty explicitly that it was set up the way it is because the framers believed that most of the citizens didn't have access to information or education and really couldn't be trusted to choose our president. Right. Am I misstating that?
You're mostly correctly stating it. James Wilson of Pennsylvania, I've got a little quiz here. How many people in this intelligent general public audience have ever heard of James Wilson? Well, see, a very small minority. So, folks, James Wilson is one of the three most important members of the Constitutional Convention, the other two being James Madison and George Washington. His contributions to the debates and the very conception of the Constitution were enormously important. It is James Wilson who was the first person who used that phrase, "we the people," of the capital U, capital S United States, to think of the United States as a single nation rather than a collectivity of individual and often quarrelsome states. It was also James Wilson who was the only delegate in the convention to propose the direct popular election of the President of the United States. He felt that the only way to create a strong nation representing we, the whole people, was to found that nation on this solid foundation, this broad base of we the people, and the executive is our only elected official who represents the whole people rather than a single constituency, must be elected by the whole people. So he proposes it very early in the convention. Zero support. Why zero support? Well, indeed, a good many of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention who were not small d Democrats. They were small r Republicans. They believed in representative government, but not necessarily aggressively democratic government. Some portion of those people, of those delegates, thought that people were just too stupid, too ill-educated, just didn't know enough. Don't trust them. But that wasn't, and that's actually kind of pretty much the standard academic argument as to why we don't have direct popular election of the president today. But that wasn't really the case. Most people had sufficient trust in the inherent intelligence of the people, but they did not trust the knowledge of the people. They thought the people were too ignorant, not too stupid, but too ignorant. How, in an age without radio, television, or any newspaper that circulated beyond a single city, could voters in Georgia know the merits of a candidate in New York or vice versa? So it was provincialism. It was the sense that the fact that these people were spread across this vast expanse of landscape, which caused them to choose. Wilson also was the one who proposed the electoral college as the next best alternative. James Madison very much wanted the National Congress because they were going to be the best and the brightest and most knowledgeable. He wanted them to elect the president. But the problem with that was separation of powers. That would make the executive overly dependent on the Congress. If Madison had had his way, we'd really have a parliamentary system of government rather than a presidential system of government. So they created this wacky system. And, if you read the section in Article 2 on the election of the president, your eyes glaze over. I mean, I try to explain this to my very bright students at the University of Pennsylvania, and their eyes glaze over. So it wasn't perfect, but it's worked reasonably well. I'm happy to accept challenges to that reasonably well statement in the Q&A
Yes,
later.
we'll have plenty of time for Q&A, so
Yeah.
save up all your
Yeah.
challenges.
And if I'm going on too long here, Mary, just nudge me.
No. We like hearing you
people,
talk.
Okay.
Oh,
all
yeah,
right.
yeah. So we'll have an electoral college for the foreseeable future as far as you're concerned.
Well, I think we will, in part because those states which are given a moderate advantage in the apportionment of electors because they get both of their senators counted as electors are going to be very reluctant to give up those powers. Those do happen mainly to be red states, but we won't go there. There is a very interesting initiative which passed the California legislature, and Governor Schwarzenegger vetoed it. And I don't know whether I think it's a good idea or not. But if enough states, if a sufficient number of states to constitute a majority of electoral votes agreed simply by a legislative act to agree to give all of their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote, that would be a way to get around that provision of the Constitution and, in effect, create a system where the candidate who received a majority of popular votes would automatically receive a majority of electoral votes. I may not have described that coherently enough, but it does work. And it's been adopted in something like 10 or 11 states and actually passed the California legislature, but Governor Schwarzenegger vetoed it. I don't know what I would have done if I'd been Governor Schwarzenegger. First of all, it does seem like an end around the Constitution, and so I'm a little uneasy about that. I'm also a little nervous because historians are inherently conservative, actually, because we really do sort of like the way the past has evolved. I'm worried about unintended consequences, particularly in an era where money plays such an important role in political campaigns. And I worry about an election decided by majority popular vote, in which you've got, say, 5 candidates, all heavily bankrolled, and the top vote getter gets 20% of the popular vote, which clearly I think would not be considered by the American people as a mandate to serve as president of we the people of the whole United States. So then you'd have to figure out some very quick and efficient way of having a runoff. And we haven't proven so far, if you look back on the election of 2000, for example, very quick or efficient about arranging our elections. So I'm a little nervous about the change, I think.
So we're in California. We're a populous state. So we think the small states have way too much power.
Yeah.
Don't you think so, being a native Californian?
4th generation Californian. It's great to be back. I grew up not too many miles from here, just north of Huntington Beach. But I've lived outside of the state for 48 years. Well, you know, the United States has a constitution which in its original form fit on 4 parchment pages, 4,300 words, another 4,000 words worth of amendments. Your state, I say now your state rather than our state. I don't know how your constitution's reaching something like 300, 400 pages and changes almost momentarily because you really are a populist progressive state which believes that you can amend your constitution anytime you feel like it. I sounded like Justice Scalia there. And I'm at odds again with my more liberal political science colleagues on this one. I think there still is some fundamental substance to federalism. And I think that while I don't think, for example, the state of Wyoming should have a veto on the Affordable Health Care Act, I do believe that people who live in the state of Montana or Wyoming have a sense of the residual sovereign power of their states and the identity of their states as being sufficiently worthy to entitle them to that extra senator or that extra electoral vote. So I'm going to have to go against the California. You've got quite enough votes here. in California. The more serious problem, and this takes us really out of the realm of constitutional history and into political history, is with the efficiency of political polling in presidential elections, it's only battleground states that get the attention of the candidates and of the media. So the classic example of the state of New York, which no matter what is always going to vote Democratic, but the presidential candidates spend about 2 minutes there because they know that there's not so much, or it's not worthwhile to spend much time there. California is blue tending toward purple, right? So you're still enough in the contest that you'll get a lot of attention.
This question isn't about Arnold Schwarzenegger, but you said the words Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I was struck discussing the article requiring that our president be a natural-born citizen. Yeah. You said that immigrants increasingly shape our culture and our politics, and so, quote, this particular constitutional provision seems a good candidate for amendment. Were you just saying that you think that that's something that will become politically viable?
I think it could become politically viable. These 18th century framers, who I admire so much, many of them were, of course, slave owners and racists, and many of the grievous errors they made, particularly further, if not enshrining, at least adding further protections to slavery in the Constitution. We have moved gradually to remedy those errors by amendment. The framers were also slightly ethnocentric. America was not only at its founding overwhelmingly a Christian nation, it was overwhelmingly an English or at least a Western European nation. And there were delegates who had concerns looking at the inevitability of westward expansion and the flood of immigration, that America would indeed become a nation of immigrants who didn't look and act like them. And that is why we have that provision in the Constitution, saying that the president must be native born. When I wrote those words in the Penguin Guide, Arnold Schwarzenegger had not yet gotten in deep doo-doo with his personal life. And I was actually thinking that there would be either an Arnold Schwarzenegger or people like him in the future, and that those people indeed should have the right to run for president. I think Arnold Schwarzenegger should have the right to run for the presidency. His chances might have gone down in recent years, but I think that we truly are a nation of immigrants. We were even then. So yeah, I think that's an amendment that might have a chance of passage. It'll have a greater chance if we can get our members of Congress, and I really do mean this, regardless of whether you're a Democrat or Republican, to just put their heads together and think sensibly and not passionately about solving our current immigration issues. I think once we move a little closer to solving those issues, then maybe the chance of passing that amendment will improve.
Sort of the flip side to that is that we should all have to either take a test or do national service. Just the fact that we're born here shouldn't entitle us to be citizens. Have you thought at all about whether we should have a little more rigorous test even for us native-born people? Whether we deserve to be citizens of the greatest?
How many of you have ever attended swearing-in ceremony for new citizens? And maybe some of you have been sworn in as new citizens. I'm mindful of the fact, particularly in California, this amazing place where that is much more commonplace than in my state. Well, I've attended several of them, and they are just wonderful. They're some of the most inspirational events you can ever attend. And I'm always struck by the fact that the people who are being sworn in know more about the way our government works than 90% of those who have not gone through that process. How do we create an informed citizenry? And boy, if you listen to people like Jefferson and Madison on this subject, they're just absolutely adamant that the only way this experiment in republicanism is going to survive is with an informed citizenry, and the alternative they think really did think would be a tyranny. And well, let me tell you, it's not making school kids memorize the Constitution. Because the Constitution, just as it's written, is boring. It's helping all of our citizens understand the important stories behind that Constitution. And that really is the way it's a living Constitution. And I think Justice Scalia would agree with me on this point. The way in which that Constitution has shaped our past, present, and will shape our future. So the great challenge in civic education, I actually don't think it's giving people tests. I think it's not prescribing what they need to know, but inspiring them to learn more. And that's what I am trying to do in this later phase of my life and in the writing that I'm trying to do.
Because you're going to continue to write for a general audience, right?
That's right. That's right. My current book project, which is not really a plug, I'm just like talking about myself, because the book won't be out. Actually, it will be out just before Father's Day, I'm told. But for those of you who are looking for a Father's Day present, but it is, I guess it was a plug. It's a prequel to my book on the Constitutional Convention. It's called Our Lives, Our Fortune, Our Sacred Honor, the final words of the Declaration of Independence. And it's on the 22 months in the Continental Congress leading up to the Declaration of Independence. In some ways, I'll confess, it's my anti-David McCulloch book, because McCulloch has made just, such a sort of, a lovable figure in John Adams. When in fact, he was a real pain in the ass. I'm sorry. I mean, he's a wonderful person. He's made these wonderful contributions. But really, about half the time in the Continental Congress, the delegates were just ready to strangle him. He just was so annoying. I'm sorry, I've got to do another digression here.
Please do.
Mary, you'll have to forgive me. But, please do. One of the really remarkable things is the number of important American revolutionary leaders who were not present at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Only 5 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence also signed the Constitution, and only 8 of those who signed the Declaration even attended the Constitutional Convention. So Tom Paine wasn't there. Thomas Jefferson wasn't there. He was serving as ambassador to France. Patrick Henry of Virginia wasn't there. And John Adams wasn't there. He was serving as ambassador to Holland at the time. And I'm often asked the question about, well, what would have happened if Patrick Henry had been there? Because he hated the Constitution and was a bitter opponent of it during the ratification debate. And of course, the Founding Fathers debated in secret. So Henry was comfortably, he'd been elected to the convention and had more important things to do back in Virginia and didn't attend. If he'd known what was going on, he would have gotten on his horse and tried to change the whole course of discussion in the convention. I think if Thomas Jefferson had been there, because Jefferson, when he first saw a copy of the Constitution, his friend James Madison sent him a copy while he was in France after the convention had adjourned. Jefferson wasn't sure that he liked everything about it. He particularly did not like the absence of a Bill of Rights, and wrote. This is something that Tea Party members ought to grab hold of. I own I am not a friend to an overly strong government. So I say, that I think if Jefferson had been there, the tone might have shifted a little bit more toward a suspicion of centralized power. I say of John Adams that if he'd been there, the convention would have lasted 8 months rather than 4 months, because he just would have gone on and on and on. So anyway, sorry.
No, nothing to apologize for. I promised that I was going to leave a lot of time for your questions, challenges, arguments, although you're going to have to keep them brief so everybody gets a chance to ask. So what we are going to do, while you are thinking, Tonya is going to, we do need to have you amplified, both for the video and just so that we can all hear your questions. So if you would raise your hand, Tonya Jones here is going to have a microphone, and I'm just going to ask one, you know what, I'm not going to ask one more questions because 2 hands went up instantly. Okay. Into the microphone.
Sort of fixated.
Into the microphone, please.
Well, I'm fixated in a manner of speaking on your having introduced this discussion by referencing, saying that the framers of the Constitution, with the exception of 2 people perhaps you mentioned, thought of it as a kind of noble experiment. That implies that these people did not have a fixed idea of how the Constitution might be, let's say, interpreted, which is hard for me to reconcile with Scalia's thinking that these words in their meaning are fixed for all time.
A fragile experiment was the phrase they used, and of course it was a more perfect union, not a perfect union. One anecdote that I like to use from the convention to illustrate this was that the delegates were debating the ratio of representatives in the House of Representatives to constituents. And the ratio under debate at the time was 1 to every 40,000. It eventually came down to 1 to every 30,000. And it said just that, 1 to every 40,000. And James Madison, quite wisely, recognizing that over time the population would increase, westernward expansion, immigration, et cetera, he said if we have a fixed ratio of representation, if this union and this Constitution is to endure for 50 or 100 years, the House of Representatives will be too large. And of course, he was absolutely right. And so he proposed that it not be a fixed ratio of representation. If it had remained a fixed ratio of representation, we would have 7,500 members of the House of Representatives today, which does not sound like a good idea to me. But anyway, Madison gives his speech, and Nathaniel Gorham of Massachusetts stands up and says, "What do you mean? This union is not going to endure for 100 years with westward expansion, et cetera, and with the diversity of interests and geography, the country will be too big to hold together." And nobody disagreed with that. This was a fragile experiment. They were doing the best they could under the circumstances. They knew that this Constitution would change. Now, by the way, Justice Scalia's answer to your question and my little spiel earlier was, Professor Beeman, that's why they were wise enough to add the amendment process. An arduous process, but that is the only way the Constitution should be changed. But in fact, it is not the only way the Constitution has changed if we look at our history.
Thank you for being here this evening. I disagree with the statement that this country was founded as a Christian nation, and I'd like your take on that.
Thank you. It is a fact that overwhelmingly the founding fathers were Christians. There were 2 Catholics in the convention, Carroll of Maryland and Thomas Fitzsimons of Pennsylvanians, but it was a Protestant Christian nation. But truly, if you read the debates in the convention, this is a secular body which understands that the business of statecraft is very different from that of... It was not divine inspiration, this was politics. The only mention of religion in the body of the Constitution, as many of you know, is in Article 6, which says there shall be no religious test for the holding of public office. And that was a position on which there was a unanimity of opinion among the framers. So there is no question in my mind that although they probably assumed, as it turned out, as things are turning out incorrectly, that demographically we would remain a Christian nation, they really did understand the importance of separation of church and state. Later, of course, articulated more explicitly in the First Amendment. Their other great error in the convention was not adding, of course, a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. I know that there are people of differing opinions on this. If you want to challenge, if anybody would like to challenge me on this now, perhaps now they should do it.
You mean on whether we have a Christian nation?
Well, this whole question about how rigorously separated church and state should be.
Yeah. So you are saying that Amendment 1, very first amendment, passed 4 years after the Constitution, it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. So if it was founded as Christian religion, why they had amendment, very first amendment like that?
In fact, most. Let me try not to put you folks to sleep here. Just a little bit of background on our Bill of Rights. They go through the whole summer debating the features of a Constitution which really was designed to empower government to do things. I'm sorry, this is my one soundbite that I have to say. I will have to say, although I'm immensely grateful to the Tea Party because they've raised interest in the Constitution immensely. It's been very helpful to my book sales. It causes people like the Newport Library to invite me to speak to groups like this one. But if you take the Tea Party's interpretation of the Constitution, it basically consists of the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, the 10th Amendment, reserving all power not specifically delegated to the states, and the first 5 words of the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law. and it ignores all of the rest of the body of the Constitution. And, I mean, I got to tell you, folks, it's right here up front. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution. This required a government that could really do stuff. And they spent the whole summer devising a government that could do those things that are very important to our common defense, general welfare, etc. So I'm a big supporter of James Wilson. I want a strong central government, but that does represent we the people. And they spent all summer debating how to construct that government. A very difficult, sometimes divisive debate. On the last week of the convention in September, George Mason of Virginia, who was the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which had a provision in it which was virtually the same language that you, sir, just read about separation of church, no religious establishment, said, look, I think that we need to add a Bill of Rights to this Constitution. And I think using the state bills of rights as our guide, we could do this in a couple of hours. He said in a few hours. And I'm making this up, but I really believe that this happened. The delegates go, oh my God, are you kidding me? A few hours? Debating the fundamental rights of mankind, and they just push it aside. They just push it aside. And so then the Constitution goes out to the people for ratification. And it turns out that the other grievous error, obviously being the adding of protections to slavery in the Constitution, which were finally rectified by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But the other great error was not understanding that this Bill of Rights was fundamentally important to our national document. But that Bill of Rights, our first 10 amendments, are modeled on similar amendments in the Declarations of Rights in the individual state constitutions, which were adopted before 1787. So this idea of separation of church and state was not something new that popped up actually in the first Congress in 1789, but not ratified by the requisite number of states until 1791. So it had a strong basis in our revolutionary heritage.
Sonia is keeping an eye on
Okay.
who's next.
I'm a control freak. I even want to move the microphone
Oh,
around.
well,
Shame
please.
on me.
How you doing? Okay, my question is, at what point did the republic or the rule of law turn into the democracy and the rule of the majority? In the Constitution, democracy is not mentioned once, and so I really have a hard time understanding why we always talk about the United States as a democracy and not a republic.
Yeah. Well, our republic did have more than any other government ever established up to that time, at least strong democratic roots. In the individual colonies, even before the Revolution, voter participation in elections was much more widespread, although it was confined to free adult males, not African Americans and slaves and women, but not even non-property owning males. But America was moving toward embracing a more democratic system of government. The framers of the Constitution, though, were nervous about the excesses of democracy. They saw the democratic excesses of some of the state legislatures in the aftermath of the Revolution as not necessarily being good things. And then, shortly after the Constitution was adopted and the new government commenced operation, a really remarkable and wholly unanticipated thing occurred, which was the development of political parties. And the development of political parties came because the very men who... Justice Scalia, are you listening to me? The very men who drafted that Constitution began to differ on the meaning of the words that they had written on those 4 parchment pages. And there were strict constructionists like Jefferson and indeed James Madison, and broad constructionists like Alexander Hamilton and President George Washington. And they differed so vehemently on how the new government should be run that this wholly unexpected development of political parties occurred. These political parties then went out and aggressively organized these candidates for presidential elector who were supposed to be the best and brightest men in their local communities, who would be elected because they were the best and brightest and use their best judgment in selecting the best candidate for the presidency. But instead, they began to recruit the masses of the populace into our electoral process. And it really was the contest for control of the government through the presidency that brought democracy to America. It didn't happen overnight, but voter participation in presidential elections went from 10% in 1788 to 25% in 1800 with Thomas Jefferson's election, to 56% in 1828 with the election of Andrew Jackson, and in 1840 with the election of Harrison to 84%. And interestingly, it stayed about in the 80s until about 1920. And we've actually been going downhill since that time, although there was a little bit of an uptick in 2008. So that's a partial answer.
Right. So a follow-up to that question would be, do you think that we can restore America through democracy, or do we have to go back to the rule of law and a set constitution?
Well, I do truly believe that we are now both a democracy which believes devoutly in the rule of law. We may differ vehemently on how to interpret some of those laws, but I think that we have been successful in pulling that one off. There's no turning the clock back. Mary and I were having a conversation earlier this afternoon that it is I at least sometimes have a tendency to get a little bit depressed about our democratic process today. Not only low voter turnout, but crazy behavior among some voters. But that is who we are, and all we can do is work, and all of our and we need the help of our media, who don't always help, in creating that informed citizenry. I do think that organizations like factcheck.org and these not-for-profit organizations that really do track the presidential candidates and track also some of the the cable channel news people and call them out when they're not telling the complete truth, are at least a step in the right direction. I'm not altogether happy about the way our democracy is functioning, but I'm not going to trade it for anything else.
I've often wondered about the necessity for the Electoral College, and I was just wondering, my question is, was this something that the framers initiated, or was it something that they had copied, where they'd seen in history or from a country in Europe?
They absolutely never copied it. It is important to remember that we are the first nation to have an elective presidential system. There were parliamentary. They weren't. I mean, England wasn't a parliamentary democracy. It was a kind of mixed government of aristocracy and democracy. But most countries that had a chief executive who had any claim to representing the people at large were elected by a majority of the members of their legislatures, to their parliaments. So in creating a president, George Washington was president of the Constitutional Convention. But what that meant was that he was the presiding officer, the moderator, until George Washington took office as President of the United States. That word president did not mean what it means today. So that was part of the experiment. And so the dilemma confronting the framers, once they decided that they weren't going to have a parliamentary system, have the legislature elect the chief executive, how do you do it? And this crazy electoral college was the best alternative that they could come up with. And they voted it down. I'm not exaggerating, at least a dozen times between early June, when James Wilson first proposed it, and really mid-September, when they finally said, okay, we'll give it a try. Sorry, but I'm a professor, so I go on about these things. If you read that mind-numbing passage in Article 2 of the Constitution, it first spells out how the Electoral College works. But then it spells out how I think many of the framers of the Constitution thought we would most often elect our president. The provision which says if no one has a majority of electoral votes, it'll go into the House of Representatives. So I think that many of the framers thought that ultimately it would be the House of Representatives who elected the president. So it's kind of just luck, serendipity, that the Electoral College has worked out as well as it has. But not just serendipity, the two-party system has played a very important role in that, I think.
The phrase retention of all rights, other rights, and retention of powers, sometimes that refers to the states. I think sometimes it refers to the national government. And similar, the associated question to you to explain this to us is what what is, in your mind, how powerful the federal government is versus the state governments?
Well, I mean, that's a $64 question. Where does that balance of power between the power of the national government and the residual sovereignty of the states rest? It has been a subject of contention. I mentioned Madison and Hamilton, the two principal authors of the Federalist Papers, the primary intellectual defense of the Constitution. 2 years after the Constitution is adopted, start disagreeing on fundamental aspects of where that balance should be. And it gets a little more confusing. So the amendment most commonly cited is the 10th Amendment. I read these not only because I like to bring out my little pocket Constitution, but because I'm getting on in age and my memory is sometimes fails me. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. And that was an amendment to keep Patrick Henry happy, who was worried that this proposed government was giving too much power to the central government. And so he wanted an amendment which reserved powers not specifically delegated, reserved to the states. But Madison, who wrote, by the way, the draft of the Bill of Rights that was drafted in the Congress, he wrote the 9th Amendment. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And what he was worried about was that the state governments would take actions which would destroy or restrain those rights. So even in the 9th and 10th Amendments, we see this tension that we still live with today. And it's a healthy tension. It has produced the very dynamism of our federal system.
I'd just like to return back to the separation of church and state for a moment with a current day perception on my part at least. And it seems to me in this polarized and divisive political theater that we're going through at the moment and have been for some time, that religion, and particularly Christianity, is permeating and impacting on the decisions of Congress in terms of how they deal with issues that can lead as far as to laws. And I personally think the Founding Fathers, in their wisdom, insisted on separation of church and state, and I hope it stays that way. But I wonder if you agree with that perception, and if so, are you concerned about it?
Yes, I am concerned about it. But first I want to go back and be an historian, then I'll jump forward and being an opinionated person. There were two reasons why most Americans of the revolutionary generation, most of whom I said were Protestant Christians, believed in separation of church and state. The first was a philosophical reason that Jefferson said it best, that the government has no more right to tell people what they should believe than they have a right to tell us what the laws of physics or algebra should be. And he has this wonderfully poetic preamble to the Virginia Declaration of Rights, that it really is one of those inherent rights of mankind, our right to freedom of conscience. It's just an area in which government has no business. And so he justified it in Lockean Enlightenment terms. But Jefferson also was living in a society itself which was divided by differing religions. the Anglicans hated Baptists, and Presbyterians weren't so sure about Methodists, and not to mention Catholics. Oh my God! But they knew that they were living in a more ethnically and religiously diverse society than had ever existed in any other part of the world, even though it was, by our standards, remarkably homogeneous. And so they knew that the mixture of religion and politics was deadly, that it would be a source of division and disruption and conflict in government. They just wanted it out of there altogether, and they were absolutely right. And when you look around the world today, generally speaking, those nations which have mixed religion and government have tended to have a bit more conflict than our own. So that's the history part of this. It is important to say that the wall of separation between church and state does only run in one direction. Government has no right to tell any of us what we should believe, how we should worship, what our religious precepts and the behaviors that result from those religious precepts should be. But it is the case that ministers of any variety of faiths do have a right to get up on the pulpit and tell government and tell politicians what they should do, and even tell their congregants how to vote. I don't like it when they do that, but they do have that right. And so, for example, David Barton, the head of Wall Builders, who's probably the most influential and media savvy of the people who've really been arguing about tearing down the wall of separation between church and state. I don't like what he says, and I'll argue with him, but he's got a right to make the argument. Period. Well, okay, so I mean, again, I don't want to get too far into immediate politics, but this recent debate on contraception in Congress was a little scary to me. It did seem to me that there really was an area in which government was making statements about if not religious belief, at least about behaviors that result from religious belief that was a little bit unnerving. And my sense is that I do ultimately trust the wisdom of the American people, and I think ultimately that issue is not going to pop up again, or it's not going to be successful. I think there was a pretty significant kickback on that one, particularly from the far more intelligent females of America.
No argument there.
This morning, NPR pointed out that if the Supreme Court strikes down health care reform, it may have a domino effect on Medicare and a variety of other health care as we know it. How concerned are you about the constitutional ramifications of this Supreme Court decision?
Well, I've certainly been following the discussion a lot. I'm a big sports fan, huge sports fan, but I was, during the 3 days of oral arguments in the Supreme Court over the Affordable Health Care Act, I was telling people, you know, guys, for me, like this is equivalent of the Super Bowl and the World Series all wrapped into one. I was just following, that just so avidly. It is still the case, I think, that 95% of the constitutional scholars, whether they're professors of law, political science, or history, if you'd asked them several months ago what they thought the outcome would be, they would have said it's going to be judge constitutional. And just looking at the sweep of America's constitutional history, And now that may be because academics are to the left of center, but it is the case that there was and is a very strong scholarly consensus that this law is constitutional. But as we've seen the debate unfold, right now, as far as I'm concerned, it's a toss of a coin. I have no idea how the court is going to rule. I believe that if Justice Scalia, in particular, but also Justice Roberts, who have frequently invoked the centrality of the principle of judicial restraint, that the court should not legislate. That's the job of Congress to legislate. That if they remain true to that belief, that they would grit their teeth and find ways to declare it constitutional. But I don't have no clear sense that that is going to be what's going to happen. Do I think that that will then lead to the repeal of Medicare and a whole scaling back? I'm going to be unhappy if it's repealed, because I actually, although I think it was badly framed, and I think using the Commerce Clause rather than the Taxation Clause to defend it, it was a bad idea. But so I'll be unhappy if it's repealed, but I think we'll figure it out. And it's not going to lead to a repeal of Medicare, because Congress really does have the power to tax to promote the general welfare. And I think it's going to be very hard to argue that Medicare is not a measure which promotes the general welfare.
So why did they defend based on the tax as opposed to Commerce Clause?
Well, you know why? Because we are living in a moment where taxation is a bad word. And Republicans and Democrats just were terrified about saying that they would raise taxes, that they would tax Americans to pay for the cost of insuring all of these additional people who would be covered by universal health care. So they justified it under the Commerce Clause and defined the not purchasing of health insurance as an act of commerce. I think actually the problem with this argument, and there are probably people in this audience who know more about this than I do, is that there are only 3 or 4 cases where the absence of action the absence of participation in commerce have been considered to be commerce. And there have been, I think, 3 or 4 cases. They pretty much split either way. But they're all trivial cases. And healthcare is not trivial. This is really big time. So the government was put in the awkward position of defending an enormously important step and an important expansion of federal government power on a rather flimsy constitutional basis, whereas it would have been very easy to defend it under the taxation power.
I'm really quite confused at some of the things that you've said. First of all, you are willing to support this Obamacare amendment, and you recognize the fact that the means with which it was done is a perversion of the Constitution when we talk about this whole Commerce Clause. So I don't understand how that coincides with the comments you made about Scalia and Roberts, being we understand the concept of the Supreme Court not legislating, but it is clearly their specific duty to ensure that legislation passed is constitutional. So as you describe both sides of the fence, being someone that's just a layman out here in the weeds, I'm trying to understand the clarity of the thinking that is going on.
I knew I was going to get in trouble on this issue. I do not believe that the law, and particularly a law as complicated as this one, was framed ideally. I think it could have been framed more clearly. And I do think, in fact, if we'd been willing to face up to the fact that Americans should be willing to pay some taxes, just as we do to support Medicare, to support universal health care, the constitutional argument would have been stronger. But number one, I really do, to go back to some of the oral arguments that occurred before the court, I don't believe that the Congress, by a significant majority at the time, and 61 votes in the Senate is a significant majority. I don't believe that the Congress was passing a law requiring people to eat broccoli or to buy a certain make of car, which was the argument used by the Attorney General of Virginia. Where's the line between mandating health care and making people buy broccoli? I really do believe that a majority of Congress believed that the provision of health care to all Americans was an important aspect of promoting the general welfare, as articulated both in the preamble and in the body of the Constitution. Not in the Commerce Clause, but in the Taxation Clause, which is why I wish they had taxes. But I do believe that the argument, and a good argument, can be made under the Commerce Clause. Like so many political issues and constitutional issues that we face, both in the present and throughout of our history, these things are never black and white. They are vast variations of shades of gray. So I do, sir, understand why you feel as you do that this is an unwarranted expansion of federal power, but I also really do understand why others believe that in this particular issue, on a matter of such importance to the general welfare, that it does lie within Congress's power. The wonderful thing about our country and our Constitution is that if my preference is favored in this decision and the Health Care Act is ruled constitutional, we'll continue to go on and survive quite happily, I think more happily, as a republic. But you know what? If it's overturned, we'll survive as well. And Congress will go back, and maybe it'll even find a better way to do it. So one way or another, it won't be the end of the Constitution as we know it. Again, I go back. Boy, Americans have been arguing about the Constitution almost from the day the government commenced operation. People are predicting doom and gloom if so-and-so is elected president or if this bill is passed, and somehow we have remained the world's oldest surviving and durable democracy. Sorry for that little preach.
Bill, about the equal branch of government, which is the Supreme Court. Can you imagine or give me a thought about what the framers of the Constitution might have said, making a lifetime appointment of a non-elected official when the life expectancy was in its 40s or 50s and not in the 80s or 90s?
So if you look at Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution, Article 1's really long. That's the powers of Congress. And Congress really was supposed to be, the framers believed in separation of powers and checks and balances, but Congress was where the action was supposed to be. And then the next largest article is the president, but nobody had ever had a president. And really, the definition of the president's powers are unbelievably vague. You read the various war powers provisions of Article 2 and you throw up your arms. You have no idea, who's got the power to do what. And then you read Article 3 on the court, and it's about that big. They did want to grant justices tenure during good behavior, which is essentially is for life unless they're impeached for really doing nutty things, because they really did believe that the court should be immune from the furor of politics. I believe that most of the framers, but not all, did believe that the Supreme Court should have the power of judicial review, although it's nowhere written in the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 78 rather specifically anticipates John Marshall's decision in Marbury v. Madison granting limited power of judicial review to the court. Did the framers of the Constitution believe that the court would assume the importance and power that it has today? Absolutely not. Did the framers believe that our federal government today would have the powers that it exercises today? Absolutely not. But did they believe that we would be living in a global economy where all of these intersecting aspects of economic development and communication and all the rest make life so complicated? They would have been pretty surprised at that as well.
She's on her way. Hold on. Thanks, Tanya.
My question has to do with the takings clause in the Fifth Amendment. And I'd like to frame the question by contrasting the way the government provides assistance to needy people in the area of food and housing. In food, the government uses its taxing authority to provide food stamps, and then people can use those. They go to the supermarket, they buy food at the prevailing prices. When it comes to housing, one of the methods the governments use is rent control, where instead of the burden of the subsidy falling upon the broad population, it's just falls on the landlords. And I always wondered, why isn't this considered an illegal taking of their property when they have to, they have to lease their property at a below market rate, lower than they would otherwise be able to get? I'm sure that must have been challenged in court. What's the rationale for saying that's not?
Well, first of all, I guarantee you that the framers of the Constitution didn't have rent control or food stamps in mind. Now, first of all, I have to say I'm out of my depth here. So you have a specific issue and knowledge that I may not have, but I actually don't know of federal cases which have ruled on rent control. Are you able to give me some? Because my sense is that rent control issues have really been decided at the state and local levels and haven't come before the federal courts. The Fifth Amendment provision on takings that's been most relevant, which really upset a good many judgments, is this notion of eminent domain, that federal government can come in and take private property and say, we're going to take this for the public good. And that is still, I think, very much in contention today. But so I'm afraid I don't have a very good answer to your question, except my sense is that that's primarily fallen in state courts. Yes.
Hello. Now I can read. Okay. I heard first about you on Jon Stewart, and I was interested in Jon Stewart. Yes.
The Daily Show.
The Daily Show. Yeah.
For those of a certain age, The Daily Show is the primary means of learning the news of the day. And for many of the rest of us, yeah, anyway, but yes.
So I quite agree with you that our media sometimes lets us down, and that thankfully we do have the internet nowadays and certain media that really discusses things in detail and makes things a little bit more transparent. So I really appreciate you coming on and being here with us and spreading your point of view as far as sharing your perspective. I am questioning, like many other people, that we do have an imperfect, but we're trying with our setup with the executive, presidential, and the judicial court system in our legislatures. But it certainly is imperfect, and I would like to hear your take on the, I forget the name of the issue is about our economy and how the corporations are considered as people.
Yes.
And I very much disagree with this.
The decision of the Supreme Court, which this is not the first time that the court has ruled that corporations are individuals. When in the post-Civil War era, when Congress and in particular state legislatures were trying to regulate monopolistic and behavior of corporations and passing laws, permitting unionization, things of that sort. And the Supreme Court in a number of cases, citing the Fifth Amendment, the right of every individual to life, liberty, and property, also considered corporations as individuals and considered them immune from legislation which would regulate their behavior. Beginning in the Progressive era, that changed, and both new congressional laws and differing Supreme Court decisions pretty much allowed, particularly under the Commerce Clause, the right to regulate the economic behavior of corporations. There is a constitutional logic to considering corporations as individuals, because corporations consist of shareholders who are individuals. Corporations have a job to serve the interests of their shareholders, so that it is not that. So there is a logic which caused the Supreme Court in the Citizens United decision, which overturned campaign finance reform laws and basically removed the limits on the amount of money that individuals or corporations could give to these political action committees. There was a constitutional logic behind it, but there was no common sense behind it. And I think what we've seen in this current primary season was the line between political action committees and the campaign organizations of the candidates themselves was virtually invisible, and that big money and the ability to buy television time played an enormous role in the outcome in some states in some of these primaries. And that this is fundamentally destructive of the idea of one person, one vote, and our democratic system. My own hunch is that the majority in the court which overturned campaign finance reform will find a way to see that, not to overturn the decision outright, but to find ways to prevent what's happened in this recent round of primaries from ever happening again. It really is a nuclear arms race, and it's not good for the Republic. And I think that a good many Republican candidates probably would embrace that idea as well as Democratic candidates.
We have time for one more, so make it good.
A lot of pressure here.
You mentioned earlier the phrases, we the people, in the Constitution, in the very first preamble, and then you said laws, the very first article says a legislature will be elected by the people and they shall pass laws. Mm-hmm. And then later on in the Constitution it says this Congress, this legislature, shall assemble. Now, my question to you is, and especially in relation to the health law, did they really read those whole 1,000 pages, everybody in Congress? Did they really assemble together in a body, or did they just, what I call gossip in their offices while 4 or 5 people are giving their speeches in Congress? My concern is that they are not really exchanging ideas in the matter that assemble means, in the way that assemble means that they are being influenced by other special interests. But they're not, if you see pictures of them, of the Congress.
There's nobody there.
You see how there's nobody there.
Although I'll tell you, they are in committee meetings, deliberating on a wide variety of issues. They do all have very large and rather expensive staffs who are briefing him on these things. I mean, what you're pointing to is a real dilemma that we haven't figured out in not only in our country but in any country. This is why I got paid so much as a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. The kind of profundity that you're about to hear right now. Things are really complicated. I mean, right? Every one of us, right, has filed a health insurance claim, right, and gone through the same, hell and purgatory to figure out our own health care expenses. These are just enormously complicated issues. And so how do you equip any body of men and women, however small, however large, to do these things in ways that are A, intelligible to we the people of the United States, so that we can, I certainly, don't know a 1/100th of the content of what's in the Affordable Health Care Act. So these are real challenges that we face in a technological age. I face this challenge every time I make a phone call to somebody in Bangladesh because I've got a problem with my Verizon telephone bill, and they've got their little sheet of answers to frequently asked questions, but my question is different. It's not their fault. It's just that we're living in a very, very complicated world, and it is. But one thing that worries me about this is that I think because politics is so frustrating, and it's also so increasingly partisan and nasty, that really smart people may be choosing not to go. I really want Bill Gates and Eric Schmidt, and I'm not sure about Mark Zuckerberg, but I want them in Congress. Not some of these folks that we have. So that's not a wholly adequate answer to your question. It's probably not a wholly adequate way to end this evening. But,
well, I'm going to give you one more chance about ending the evening. A couple of things in closing. We have a defender of democracy here tonight, a bookseller. If you would like to come by a Penguin Guide to the U.S. Constitution, Dr. Beeman has graciously consented to sit here for a few minutes and sign books. In closing, can you comment on something for me? At the Searching for Democracy Forum that Cal Humanities put on last year, a woman asked one of the panelists, the writer Chris Abani, why can't we have discourse? Why does everything have to be a debate? We're not really listening if we're debating. And he said, well, when we listen, it makes us vulnerable. And you like to quote Mr. Franklin, saying, that each delegate at the Constitutional Convention maybe should doubt a little of his own infallibility. Can you just wrap it up for us?
It's my, oh, thank you so much for asking that. Because it is a great way to end. But I'm going to take more than a minute because I got to tell the whole story. So Benjamin Franklin, who was the founder of my university and the great hero of the city in which I've lived for 44 years, Philadelphia, was the oldest delegate to the Constitutional Convention at 81. His contributions to the debates in the convention were at best uneven. By the way, this is very weird, in fact. He proposed, when they were having trouble reaching a decision on the issue of representation, that they bring a minister into the convention to lead them in prayer every day to help them reach a decision. And everybody, and Franklin, a deist who really, wasn't a person who believed in a divine hand. And they all went, oh, no. And they, oh, thank you so much, Dr. Franklin, but we couldn't afford to pay him, and so on and so forth. Again, they just didn't want a minister in there. They really did believe in this separation of church and state. Anyway, so Franklin makes a lot of semi-wacky proposals in the convention, one of them being that he thought that Supreme Court justices should not be appointed. They should be elected by the popular vote of all of the lawyers in the country. Yeah, and that his logic was that the lawyers, if they elected the best and brightest among them, they'd get rid of them, and then they could take their practice from them, and that way you could ensure. And the delegates kind of rolled their eyes, excuse the expression, heavenward, and went on to other business. So I mean, he was sort of drifting in and out of, lucidity. But on the very final day of the convention, on September 17th, after this 4 months of debate and disagreement, and it was known that there were many, many delegates in the convention who not only disagreed with certain passages of the Constitution, but also who might not sign it. And it was very important to get as close to unanimity as possible. A mere majority was not going to create this more perfect union. So he gave this speech, or he wrote this speech, and he was too weakened by illness to deliver it. He gave it to my hero, James Wilson, to read it for him. And in this speech, he begins with just one of the, again, it's common sense, but it's so sagacious. He said, whenever you assemble a group of men, but he could have said men and women, to gain the benefit of their common joint wisdom, you also assemble with those men all of their passions, jealousies, religious differences, regional prejudices, etc., etc. And from such, which is true of any Congress, any political body that we elect and then gather, that we elect them for their joint wisdom, but they also bring with them this diversity of interest and ideology and political point of view. And Franklin said, from such a group could a perfect production ever be expected. And he went on to say that there were provisions of the Constitution which he himself did not approve. He didn't like the idea of a single executive, because Pennsylvania had a plural executive. He said, but I ask those of you who still harbor doubts about this Constitution to put aside your objections, to doubt a little your own infallibility, and to sign this document in spite of your objections. And it was in that spirit of fallibility, of humility, that 39 of the 42 delegates present that day went up and signed the document. And that's the lesson that I want our members of Congress today to absorb. To doubt a little their own infallibility, to doubt that their political position is absolutely the right and immovable, one and just act with a bit more humility, and maybe we'll approach more closely the kind of success achieved by the framers of the Constitution. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Beeman.